I got involved in mine action in 1994 when I joined a small demining organisation called the Halo Trust, who are now a massive organisation. I then spent 8 thoroughly enjoyable years bouncing around the world, working in places like Mozambique, Angola, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Kosovo. Had a nice year in New York, setting up Halo USA, and then did an MBA at London Business School, and then made the mistake of joining the UN. Initially for a year to pay off my loan, and I'm still there 15 years later. UN is one of those interesting organisations that is utterly useless, but you can only make a change from inside, and I think we've made some good changes in the last 10 years, and what we've achieved is pretty good. So I'm pleased with that, although I really should get a different job. I'm going to touch on sustainable development goals, but I'm happy to talk about any of the issues we've covered. I'm going to start with a video, because then you can actually have a snooze without listening to me speak. You just listen to me on the tape. The first time I went into Mosul, I was driving through East Mosul, and then as we crossed the bridge into West Mosul, it took my breath away. The amount of devastation. I've visited many post-conflict environments, ranging from Afghanistan into the Balkans, throughout Africa, and I don't think I've ever seen a part of a city that was so pulverized. It was very reminiscent of images of the Second World War, of Stalingrad, of Hamburg, Coventry, completely blown apart. Mosul is a city in northern Iraq. It lies between Erbil and the Syrian border, and when ISIS was at the peak of its control, there were over 2 million people living in Mosul. It was the biggest city under ISIS control. As the city was surrounded, they fell back into defensive positions. They'd had 2 years to prepare these, and the majority of these were in the old city, so West Mosul, on the banks of the river. And these buildings had been booby-trapped, they'd been rigged with explosives, they had caches of ammunition and weapons for the fighters to use. The fighters were wearing suicide vests and prepared to fight to the end, and the coalition forces dropped a lot of ordnance on them. And so the explosive hazard and the explosive contamination in Mosul is unlike really anything I've seen before. So you would have buildings were collapsed in on bodies. Some of the buildings had been booby-trapped or rigged with explosives to stop people returning home. And then there was the unexploded ordnance from just the actual fighting. When you look at that level of devastation, people just can't get back to their homes. They're finding it very difficult. The fridge might have been booby-trapped, so if you open the fridge door, it goes off, or a light switch gets flicked and there's a bomb waiting for you. On top of the different explosive hazards, a lot of the buildings are very unstable. So if when the teams are clearing, they were to move the wrong piece of rubble, the whole building could collapse on them. So it's just a really difficult and challenging environment. So people will continue to not be able to return to their homes or rebuild their homes until the explosive hazard has been cleared. The actual searchers, the guys who are doing a lot of the grunt work, who are on the ground on their hands and knees, they're Iraqis. They're the real unsung heroes. Going out and finding out where items are. Often items are brought in by people who found them in their homes or found them in their gardens, and they bring them to our team sites, and then our teams work to destroy these items. But also then looking at some of the new technology like drones, and being able to put a drone over a site and look to see what the potential hazard is, and seeing things from different perspectives, and looking at, are there obvious threats? Can we see an explosive device that is visible? Can we see indicators that an explosive device might have been laid? Can we look at different avenues of approach, and to be able to see where we can provide the most benefit? And if you want people to go home, you have to create an environment that they feel safe. And that's not just their home being removed of explosive hazards, but it's allowing them to have access to clean water, to electricity, for the schools to be cleared so that their children can go back to school, so that health posts can be cleared so they can be refurbished, so that hospitals are safe, so that the doctors can start having procedures and surgery. And a lot of the work we've been doing has been working to ensure that we prioritise the tasking we do that has the most impact. So if we clear a water treatment plant that's going to provide 250,000 people a day with clean water, or we clear a bridge so it can be repaired and 1,000 vehicles an hour can cross it, what will give the most impact? What will give us real value add to the work we do? And it was incredible when I was in Mosul to see how quickly families would go back into the rubble of West Mosul and relay their foundations and start building their homes again. I mean, it's really incredible to see how proud they are and how they want to get on with their lives. They've gone through a terrible conflict, and they're showing a resilience that is very inspirational. And we can help them by removing the explosive hazards, then people can feel confident and they can start getting on with their lives.
All right, thanks. I showed that, other than of course for my own ego, primarily because it's very easy to sit in London or New York or Geneva and forget what people actually face. Going over to Iraq several times in the last couple of years really has brought back to me why I'm in mine action and why I find this job so fascinating and what's going on. Being in a refugee camp 20 miles south of Mosul last year and seeing the absolutely horrific conditions that people live in and the fact that they can't go home because of an explosive hazard, really does remind us of what we do and why we do it. And very powerful. I haven't been in a refugee camp for about 15 years and I'd forgotten just how thoroughly disgusting they actually are. The big thing I think that I wanted to focus on today is, we're talking about technology and obviously, anti-vehicle mines featured this morning, but I thought it was interesting that the first speaker, the lady who introduced it, was talking about impact. Because for me, mine action, having been doing it for quite a while, a few people have said I'm nuts for doing it, but nobody's ever said I'm doing a bad job or it shouldn't be done. So I don't think anybody ever thinks that the people who are doing demining around the world are not doing something that's very valid and worthwhile. I think that's something that is actually a challenge for us to address, because for 25 years we've got away with being output driven and saying that we've cleared 10,000 mines or 1,000 kilometres of road, and people have gone, oh, that's good, we'll give you it. And so we end up talking about dollars per square metre or how much does it cost to clear a mine? And actually that's utterly irrelevant, because what is the impact of that mine being there? I talked about perception this morning, but if I said to you, this room is rigged with an IED, nobody would be in here, or one of us would be in here wearing a bomb suit and with a pair of pliers, but nobody else would be. And even if there was just a chance there was, people wouldn't come in. So how do you address perception when there may not actually be a problem? And one of the real challenges I think we've got to think about is the amount of resources that are coming into mine action is very limited. And because of that, we need to show our relevance. And if we can't show our relevance, then we're not going to get any funding. If we can't prioritise the very limited resources we're getting from the donors, we're not going to be able to show our relevance, we're not going to be able to get anything done. And if we can't show the value add of what we do, so we need to be thinking about value add, relevance and prioritisation to ensure impact and outcomes, not just outputs. And so that's why I've decided to talk about sustainable development goals as part of, I knew I wouldn't make this work. work. So I'll just start off with the mine action strategy. Every 5 years, the UN system comes up with a strategy around what its focus for mine action is going to be over the next 5 years. And for the last 18 months, we've been in a very consultative process, and all of the entities involved in mine action have been consulted on this. But I think it's important to remember when you start something out is why do you have a strategy? What are you trying to get to? What is the goal? And again, this is very aspirational. To contribute to a world free from the threat of explosive ordnance by protecting and assisting individuals and communities and contributing to the establishment of safe environments conducive to sustainable peace and development. Now that's the only bit of the slide I'm going to read. You can read the rest of it yourselves. But a lot of this is, why are we trying to do it? Why are we trying to do it? How are we going to make it happen? What is it going to be? What's the impact? Now, one of the core objectives of the UN, you've probably heard of the Millennium Development Goals, has now been the Sustainable Development Goals. And the 17 of these, although in Cambodia and Laos are of interest, they've added an 18th, which is mine-free, or explosive hazard-free. So it's interesting, 2 countries that have been dealing with the legacy of explosives for so long have decided to make that an 18th goal for themselves. But if you think about these goals, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, these are just the basic rights that every human being should be entitled to. Yet remember, most people are living on under $2 a day. 1 billion people don't have access to clean water. There's a lot of these issues out there. But how are you going to get to that if you can't go home because you're frightened about being blown up? Or you can't get the drilling machine down the road because there's an anti-tank mine on it. Or you can't deliver the seeds and tools to restart an agricultural economy. Or you've got the seeds and tools dropped in by aircraft, but then you can't get the produce to market. Or there's no schools that are safe. So all of these things, we're very bad at explaining that by removing that explosive hazard, by mitigating that threat, by employing individuals so that they have a job and they have a sense of well-being, all works towards these sustainable development goals. When we mapped it out, every unmasked program, because we've just redone it, so if you take the 17 unmasked programs across the 17 development goals, actually every development goal is ticked by at least one program. So somewhere on one of the 17, 18 programs we've got, every single development goal is being covered. And to me, that is something that a lot of people aren't understanding. And so, this morning there's an investigation into war crimes in Iraq. We told the team that was doing it they needed to factor in explosive ordnance disposal support from day one. Today, they're asking for a response within 3 days on a site that may have war crimes, war grave. They have no EOD team, and they haven't budgeted for it. But for 18 months, we've been telling them they would need to do it. So they will now sit around for 6 weeks, being paid to not do any work because they can't get in until we do EOD support. And it's that sort of message that needs to be replicated again and again to show the relevance of what we do. Again, looking at this in a different way, but land release, risk education, supporting survivors, keeping weapons out of circulation. One of the big problems in Iraq is that as the coalition drove in, they failed to secure the weapons that were there. And those weapons fell into the wrong people's hands. So it's thinking about the consequences. Libya, we estimate there's something like 300,000 tons of unsecured weapons and ammunition in Libya. To put that in context, the Libyan Navy was the 4th biggest holder of weapons and ammunition in the Libyan armed forces. The Libyan Navy held more ammunition than the whole of the UK. So the British Army, Navy and Air Force had less ammunition than the Libyan Navy. And when the Libyan regime was overturned, did anybody do anything to secure that? Did they buggery? And that is now floating around out there. One of the things that we need to think about is the importance between coordination and prioritization. Because one of the big challenges we've got on this is that a lot of people are out there doing different things that we don't know about. So, UNICEF might be doing a vaccination campaign. FAO might be distributing seeds and tools. If we don't know what everybody else is doing, what their priorities are, we can't figure out how explosive hazards may be stopping them, but they may not be aware explosive hazards are there until it's too late. So this need for coordination, for communication, to understand the prioritization of what's going on, information management, technology. 20 years ago, we had a database that digital cameras used to overload because you couldn't put the pictures in because there wasn't enough memory on the computer. Now the information management systems that are out there, you think you can play Pokemon Go and there's a poke stop on every corner. We should be able, in theory, to have every known minefield and every contamination on any mobile phone so people don't go anywhere near a dangerous area. Have we got there yet? No, we haven't, because we're not joined up properly in the way that we're trading information, that we're sharing information, taking advantage of the information management systems that are out there. So we need to be much better at identifying our needs, prioritising what we're doing, showing our relevance, mobilising resources against the targets that are there, and then implementing projects against the real project lifecycle. At lunch we were talking about some of the technology this morning. One of the big challenges I think in Mine Action is that because we do good work, we're not particularly good at defining what we should be doing or what we need. And so the scope of work or the statement of work is not accurate. And because it's not accurate, we get products developed or products provided that we don't need or we're paying too much for. When I saw the spec for that detector this morning, I remember when that was being written a long time ago, and you look at it and you think, yeah, maybe we could just tweak that a little bit now with hindsight, and we might have saved quite a bit of money or had a more realistic product. And I think this is something, again, is that we strive for excellence when actually good enough would be enough, and we pay too much for it and then deliver it late. So, the model that we use could be improved dramatically just by thinking and prioritising better and understanding sometimes you can't get 100%. But, if it's the difference between clearing the mines on the top of the hill that affect the goat herder or clearing the lock that allows water irrigation to cultivate 10,000 hectares of land, which of the two is the more important task? And thinking about that and looking at it from a bigger perspective. And also, if you've got a group of tasks in this geographic area and a group in this area, don't zigzag between priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because you're spending half your life driving. So think about how you cluster and task. And I know this all sounds very obvious and easy in an academic environment here, but actually on the ground, these are the mistakes that people make again and again, and it costs a lot of money, and we don't achieve the results we could do if we were better at this. One of the examples I want to use as a good little project is the CPP risk education in Gaza. Now, and again, I would say this is an interesting one over headlines. We cleared 120 deep buried bombs, which involved a guy going down with an excavation tool and digging a tunnel sometimes 4 or 5 meters deep and then into the base of the bomb, where he then physically took 2 wrenches or 2 adjustable spanners and manually extracted the fuse from the back of the bomb. Now that's a pretty brave bloke, and he did it on 120 times. But that's not the real big impact of what we've done in Gaza. That's just a very heroic bloke who made a difference in a limited way. We allowed 50,000 homes to be rebuilt in Gaza without 1 casualty from an explosive device. That's impact. Now, what we're doing in Gaza, as you may be aware, has quite a difficult situation. And every so often they fire rockets out, and then the Israelis retaliate. So unfortunately, we're fairly sure there will be another conflict in Gaza. We don't know if it'll be today, 6 months, 6 years, but it probably will happen. But again, as was alluded to this morning, when there's a war, people are happy to fund. Before the war, nobody's interested. So what we're trying to do is engage with the civilian population on how to make it safer for them in the event of the next conflict. Now, we can talk about this is a bomb, don't touch it, this is a grenade. But actually, when you think about how a family is going to be affected in that type of urban environment, what they need to think about is, have they pre-positioned some food? Have they got water? Have they got a bucket, and preferably with a lid, because they might have to use it? Have they got a fire extinguisher, and do they know how to use it? Have they done anything to stop the hazard from flying glass from their windows? So maybe put some tape on the windows or hang heavy curtains or both. And preparing them for that, as well as being aware of what is. Now, the interesting thing in that context is, who is really interested in that message? Well, it's generally the mothers. Who are the people who generally get killed or injured by UXO in Gaza? Young men, 15 to 25. Who do they listen to? Not Fat Yorkshireman who stands there and says, don't pick this up. But they are scared of their mothers, and they do occasionally listen to their sisters. So by engaging with women of influence, we're able to influence the people who are at risk from the hazard that we're trying to address it with, while at the same time preparing the family for the next conflict. So I'm using this as an example as a well-designed, well-thought-out, high-impact project that costs probably $20 per beneficiary, as opposed to it probably cost us about $40,000 per bomb to clear those bombs. So, interesting. Syria, again, a difficult and complex environment to be in. For a lot of the time, the Syrians themselves, or the Syrian government, have been very wary or suspicious of anything to do with mines and hazards, especially as it's dominated by British ex-military guys in the UN system. I can't get a visa to go to Syria because I'm British and ex-military, which makes running projects quite difficult. So again, how can we engage with them to make sure that we understand what the problem is, how we make things happen, how we can get in there, and looking at innovation and life-saving things. I mean, I mentioned Halo. I visited Halo's operation in Amman a couple of years ago, and they were doing everything remotely, working, using WhatsApp, video links back from drones on the ground. They didn't have any white technical advisors on the ground, but they were doing projects remotely. And I just thought, what a great piece of innovation that shows that they're thinking about technology and thinking about how to operate in an environment where we haven't been able to operate for 9 years because we haven't shown the imagination to come up with that. And again, there is no monopoly on good ideas, and I think we should be learning from it. Every time I press this button, I keep forgetting this one. Right. Again, Iraq, the different things. I think the video probably showed it enough. But again, what are we looking at? How we can facilitate stabilization, how we can ensure there's a humanitarian response. What is early recovery? And that's another thing. These buzzwords that you'll hear, early recovery, humanitarian response, stabilization, they're different in different countries and different contexts. Understand what the donors mean by that. Understand what the beneficiaries are going to be. Design your project around it. But don't be driven just by the use of buzzwords. So there's so many different terms being used, but a lot of it is this coherent? Is it adding value? And is it going to enable people to get on with their lives? Big thing we've been moving into is IED threat mitigation. We had some examples from the heat map this morning on Mali. Mali is interesting in that it's a big project, but it's not really a humanitarian project yet, but it's starting to move into it. 50% of all peacekeepers in the world last year were killed in Mali. More than 50% of those were killed by IEDs, which is a political issue. The Security Council gets upset when peacekeepers die. And so we were tasked to find a solution to this. And a lot of it was really simple stuff. We managed to bring the casualty rate down in Mali dramatically just by teaching the troops who thought they were deploying to Cyprus to be monitoring a peace, that they were going into a warfighting mission where they were going to be targets. How to get out of their armoured vehicle in contact. How to react in a situation. How to use the detectors they were being issued with. I know this probably sounds really simple, but again, if you're an African peacekeeper who's never left your home country and suddenly you're deployed into a war zone in Mali and you've been given kit and you don't know how to use it, when they hit you in an ambush, you panic, you run, and you get executed. So a lot of it was really simple, basic stuff, just letting people understand that they were operating in an environment that was a little bit different to what they expected. Capacity enhancement, always a joy. But what does capacity building mean? I mean, in its best sense, it would be to turn around and say that a national government passes legislation on the Ottawa Treaty and the Cluster Munition Treaty, destroys all its stockpiles and pays for all its sovereign territory to be cleared. UN not needed. Simple. Doesn't quite work like that, but people again get obsessed with capacity building when actually it can be as simple as training 20 deminers, or it could be pushing for legislation to go through. But every country is different and the needs in those countries are different. And again, it's thinking about impact, thinking about relevance and what does it do. Interestingly, Sudan, Khartoum, I worked in for 3 years, was probably one of the most difficult countries with regard to the government in terms of running mine action programs back in 2004, 5, 6. They actually kicked out every international NGO who had done demining. They were under sanctions and they were being difficult with the UN. However, they transitioned to a UNDP-supported capacity enhancement project, and you would say UNDP, UN Development Programme, all about capacity development. It utterly didn't work with Sudan. So they asked us to go back, and that changed the power dynamic. And suddenly they realized that we had something to offer them, and that actually it was one of the few issues in the international community that they wanted to engage in, which is become OTTWA compliant, because they were getting some kudos for it, because they were doing quite a lot of other nasty things. And so Sudan is actually one of the more successful capacity enhancement projects we've done. They've passed legislation, they make their own treasury available to support the project, and they've declared about 90% of Sudan mine-free. Really interesting project for what is really a pariah state. So I'm just going to flick through some slides here. This year's theme, as I said, was SDGs, and this is just some images from where we're trying to show the relationship between the SDGs and what we do. So the boss has allegedly to have said, peace without mine action is complete. Sorry, is an incomplete peace. There you go, he said it. Any questions? Good, done.
Hey, I just wanted to ask, how viable do you think is the goal of containing conventional munitions given the proliferation of IEDs? And an interesting fact that I've noticed a couple of months ago is that actually there is now a demand for IEDs in Libya. So despite the fact, in Fazan specifically, despite the fact that there a lot of conventional stockpiles are there, apparently there is also a need to smuggle, and actually a couple of weeks ago about 500 kilos of ammonium nitrate were stolen from a warehouse in Tunisia to sort of to satisfy a demand in the region. So do you think it's viable to focus on containing the weapons when there is a threat of IED proliferation which cannot be contained by those means, and how do you contain that threat at all?
I would say, how many people got shot in Japan or the UK last year, and how many got shot in the US? 30,000 got shot in the US, not many in Japan or the UK. Do you know why that is? Because they have rules about containing weapons. So if we don't contain them, we're not going to do anything about the problem. You know, we should be cutting up surplus weapons, we should be marking them properly, we should be registering them, we should be trying to keep them under state control. I mean, again, put it in perspective, there's estimated 60 to 70 million weapons under the control of armies around the world and 300 million in the US. You know, so in terms of IED components, the more we can do to secure them, the better it will be. I personally would be amazed if somebody is buying ammonium nitrate in Tunisia to take it into Libya, because you can buy military-grade explosives very cheaply in Libya. But maybe, I would think it's more likely going down into Algeria or towards Mali, but I'm not tracking that, that's not part of my job. But there is no shortage of military-grade explosives in Libya. And the issue in Libya is, it's now P for plenty. We've come across truck bombs that would make the Canal Hotel bomb look small. So 10 tons of military-grade explosives packed into the back of an armoured truck that has been lined up to probably drive at the next UN compound. So I spent yesterday evacuating our team from Tripoli, so yeah, Libya's not the best place at the moment. I mean, in Mali, we had an incident last month where 2 vehicle-borne IEDs with homemade explosives attacked a UN compound. First one blew the gates off, second one got in. 800 kilos of homemade explosives in the back with 200 litres of diesel. You know, these guys are now making some seriously big bombs. But containing it, you can only try. Yeah? If the boy had taken his finger out the dike, it would definitely have flooded. Putting the finger in probably stopped it for a while. Who knows?
Hey. Thanks for that presentation. Really enjoyed that. And I'm very interested in the CPP concepts and that integration of more holistic style stuff with sort of mine action, outreach activities and risk education. So the question I have is, do you see, and this comes from a previous experience with UN agencies, just that balance of seeing it's UNDP's bag or it's UNMAS or it's UNHCR? Because increasingly, as you do these more holistic approaches, do you see risk of different agencies perhaps sort of stepping on each other's toes or not coordinating as effectively? And I just see that as that also goes to beyond the UN, other mine action operators and NGOs.
I agree. I think it's probably one of the biggest challenges in the sector. And when I say the sector, I mean the aid sector. There's a huge amount of ego. There's a lot of rivalries between agencies. The UN, and I'll take my hat off when I say this, is when I brief entities that want to do business with the UN, one of the things I say is, remember, it's not united. It's 193 member states, 73 agencies, funds and programs, and about 10,000 egos, all with their own agenda. But it falls under an umbrella system. I think in Mine Action particularly, we are pretty well joined up as long as we don't step on each other's toes. But as soon as we start stepping on each other's toes, everybody gets very protective. Everybody asks for coordination but doesn't want to be coordinated. And I think one of the ways around this is to look at better and more open, transparent partnerships. But there's also, again, to show the value of, if you deliver effective programs, people want to reward success, so you bring money into the sector and people do what they do. I mean, when I started at UNMAS, we used to do under $10 million of peace support per year. We now do over 200 million. Our global budget was 30 million, it's now 250 million. People aren't giving us $250 million a year because they really like UNMAS. They're giving UNMAS $250 million a year because we deliver projects that show relevance, add value, have a method of prioritization, and particularly in the context of peacekeeping, help save peacekeepers' lives or enable peacekeeping mission mandates to be fulfilled. If that didn't happen, they wouldn't fund us. So I think we need to go back to the humanitarian side of it, because we've done it quite well in peacekeeping, and try and show this sort of value. So like the CPP program, I love that program because to run a traditional mine risk education program, let's say, would probably be $25 per beneficiary, and the CPP, it's 30. It's a fractional increase in costs, but you're delivering a much more comprehensive product that's more relevant. And it also allows us to engage with an underrepresented set of stakeholders, which is women, in a Muslim environment or in that particular context, and empower people and build up networks in different ways. And there's a lot of value in that, and I don't think we've necessarily understood it. I mean, the Secretary General talks about SDGs, youth, and gender empowerment. And remember, gender isn't just women and girls, it's men, women, boys and girls, specific to the context in which their gender is causing a problem. Small boys being raped in Afghanistan is not an issue for middle-aged women, unless it's their son that's who's being raped, and then it is a significant issue. So it's understanding the context of what's going on, designing the programs around it, and getting people to buy in. The program in Gaza was done very much in partnership with MPA, and that partnership has allowed us to really work well together. I don't think it would have worked as a purely UN project, because we wouldn't have got the buy-in, and we wouldn't have had the seed. Now we're looking at rolling it out, and we're engaging with the Swedish government, who are really into gender empowerment and youth because of the SDG statements. And if they can engage with the EU, which the UN traditionally has issues with because they're too bureaucratic entities, we could possibly pull in $30 million or 30 million euros through the Swedes to engage with MPA and take the project in Gaza from being 50,000 to 500,000 beneficiaries. So it's those economies of scale and the different strengths that are there. But to do that, you've got to map the stakeholders and then understand who's being driven by what. And a lot of the time, again, it goes back to, just because we do good work, people don't think they should necessarily explain on why they're doing it. And because they don't explain it to the donors, we don't achieve what we could achieve.
I'm Tom Gillespie from ITAD. I'm interested in the idea that at some point, as you reach the end of clearance, or ERWs or mines, whatever you want to describe it, in a particular country, increasingly, if your prioritisation has been done right, increasingly the socio-economic benefits of that clearance is going to diminish. And is there a point, in your opinion, where clearance is no longer worthwhile from a socio-economic point of view? And should clearance actually stop at that point? And a related question, has UNMAS ever turned around to a funder and said, we're not going to take your money because we think this isn't worthwhile in this particular location?
Yes, and yes. I definitely think that a country like Mozambique could have been declared mine-free much sooner, because the number of mines that were left and the casualties from it were insignificant, and yet several $1 million of donor funds were used to pursue the idea of Mozambique being mine-free when it was actually impact-free much sooner than it was declared. I think a great example is the Falklands. You know, why are we spending millions and millions of pounds to clear mines that won't even blow up a penguin in an environmentally fragile environment that costs even more? Why don't we just say, there is no impact from this, it's mine-free or it's impact-free, the money will be used to clear mines in Afghanistan or Syria. So I personally think that one of the challenges of the Ottawa Treaty, and this is from, again, a personal, not UN perspective, is nobody expected the Ottawa Treaty to actually get signed and ratified. And if Diana hadn't actually died, it might not have happened. You know, it was that sort of whimsical either way. So when it was signed and ratified, nobody actually thought 20 years on we were going to achieve it. So there's some clauses in the Ottawa Treaty which are actually completely unworkable because they're la-la land. And a lot of the people in the implementing support unit conveniently forget this. So I think, yes, there are many situations in states where you should say the economic benefit of this and the impact of what's left is unviable, stop it. Absolutely. Now, we've had situations where certainly I've turned around to some donors and say, and Mozambique was a good example. Why are you funding something in Mozambique when actually there is much more impact in Angola or Cambodia or Afghanistan? But the donors wanted to fund the clearance, so there is a political dimension to that. But certainly, when we were getting a lot of assessed contribution for South Sudan, you know, the UN was giving us nearly $50 million a year. I was saying to most donors, do not fund bilaterally in South Sudan. The problem that is in South Sudan is being dealt with by the assessed contribution. Use your money for countries that don't have that resource. But that shocked quite a lot of people because they did not expect somebody in the UN to be saying that. But, sorry, the other thing, back to the point, Afghanistan now, 95% of casualties don't come from mines. So there are countries out there that the problem is getting worse. And so there is going to be a need for clearance. And there are still massive issues about unsecured weapons. A lot of, particularly in Africa, the ammunition storage facilities were built by the colonial powers and have never been maintained since independence. And so, you know, places like Ivory Coast, where we ran a project for 5 years, has probably got the most internationally compliant set of storage facilities in sub-Saharan Africa. That was a $25 million investment from the UN as part of peacekeeping. There's probably another 40 countries in Africa could do with a similar project. That's $1 billion.
Can I do one last question? Because there's a debate at the end, because I was going to run.
Thanks. My question is about unsecured weapons and potential scenarios where things could go very wrong, and what if there is any room for preparedness. And I'm thinking about multilateral room for preparedness. I'm thinking about Venezuela, whether there could be an armed conflict there or the state collapses. There is already, of course, there are lots of guns out there, and the level of armed violence. For many years, Caracas has been one of the most violent cities on earth in terms of gun violence for many, many years. But really, things could get much worse. I'm thinking about, in my view, there is a real risk that weapons in the hands of the armed forces, if the state collapses, they could just go all over the place, and that could be a big problem where you have countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, Brazil, where there are already huge levels of armed violence, and these weapons go out. That could cause a big mess. Is there any room or any possibility to take some proactive action? With this, I'm not saying that the scale will be the same or could be the same as in Libya, but learning from experiences such as that one, is there any way that there could be some form of collective preparedness against such scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a great example of this was Ivory Coast, where as part of the wind down of the peacekeeping mission, UNMAS with Halo did a project to refurbish ammunition storage areas, police stations, armories, up to International Ammunition Technical Guidelines and Standards, ISACs, now called mosaics. And subsequent to that project, there were 2 mutinies by the Army. In both cases, the mutineers were unable to get into the weapons and ammunition stores that we'd refurbished. And the mutiny was, I wouldn't say put down, but the mutiny came to an end before they had access to any weapons or ammunition from any of the stores that we had refurbished or built. So it helped diffuse the situation. If those stores hadn't been there, probably at least 1,000 weapons would have got into the wrong hands, and those mutinies may then have flared into full conflict rather than being calmed down. So it does work when it happens, absolutely, but you have to invest in it. And it has to be done in advance. And the problem is, when you start talking about prevention, if a tree falls in the wood and nobody hears it, did it make a noise? You know, we're trying to prove a negative, and it's always very difficult to get the funding of a negative because nobody knows what's going to happen. You can only say an example like this. The other thing, using Libya as an example, we were again engaging with women so that when men or boys came home, they would tell them to clear their weapon, which means take the magazine off, take the round out, put it in the magazine, separate the magazine and the weapon from each other, put the hand grenade on the top shelf, don't leave a pistol in the bed beside you, take the magazine out. So basic weapon safety. You know, that isn't going to stop a conflict, but it is going to stop the 5-year-old shooting his sister. You know, or the teenage boy shooting his mother by accident. So there's basic weapon skill and safety. And again, how effective was that project? I don't know how many people were shot in Libya last year and if any were less this year, but I think it made a difference. I mean, I was thinking if we rolled out the program in Texas, we'd probably get a good result.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's stop here because we're running. Very interesting talking.